This is James Sandy. Today is June 13th, 2024, and I am interviewing John Luckadew. This interview is taking place on Zoom and is sponsored by the UTA Department of History and Geography as part of the Texas Veterans Project. Good morning, Lucky. Thank you for being here. It's a real honor to include you and your story in our project. Where I'd like to get started is kind of your origins, right? Where are you from originally? What can you tell me about growing up?
Well, I originally was born and raised in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was born in 1922, 102 years ago, and grew up there and went to public schools and until Pearl Harbor, when I joined the Army Aviation Cadets to learn to fly and join the Air Force.
Very interesting. How about your family? What was your family life like?
Well, I had three siblings. I had an older brother and sister and a younger brother. Both of my brothers served during World War II. My older brother was a commissioned lieutenant commander in the Navy and spent the entire war in Washington, D.C. We learned later, did not know at the time and couldn't know for some time, that he was engaged in biological warfare or developing biological warfare. And my younger brother was an ensign in the Merchant Marines and spent the war flying the North Atlantic on Liberty ships, supplying war material to the European theater.
Wow, so it's a full family effort, huh?
Well, all of us males, except my father, engaged in the war effort. And I would like to add a postscript at this point because in retrospect, when Pearl Harbor occurred, the United States was galvanized into mobilization to support the war effort. And the country came together like it had never done before. It was totally and completely and 100% supportive of our efforts those of us who were engaged on the front lines. And that was something that has never really been acknowledged or recognized fully. I think it's quite a shame that it hasn't been, because those who were not in uniform certainly gave us such overwhelming support and outproduced the world. They produced all the war material, not only for us ourselves, but for our allies. And the world has never seen such a production and such an action. And those home front heroes, as I call them, should be acknowledged and we should set aside a day of acknowledgement for appreciation for the country, because many families are still contributing and supporting loved ones serving overseas today. And that is not a factor that society recognizes in this country to the degree that I feel, and those of us in my generation feel, sadly neglected.
So you mentioned your siblings who served in the war effort. What did your father do for a living?
My father was an independent stockbroker, and of course, our family was very acutely affected by the crash of the stock market in 1929 and the subsequent depression that the country went through prior to World War II. He did recover But at one point, all of our assets for the family were in stock. And of course, when the market cratered, we felt it severely, and it made quite a difference in our lives. It was a turning point.
If you don't mind sharing, what was that like in like the immediate aftermath of the crash in 1929, or what do you remember from that period of your life?
Well, prior to the crash, my father was a horse fancier. He raised show horses, Arabian show horses, and we had a stable of horses that he trained and maintained. And our family, unlike most families, had two cars. My mother also had her own car, and in the 1920s, that was rare. We vacationed for a full month as a family, except for my father, on the East Coast at Wilmington Beach or Wrightsville Beach in North Carolina, and we lived the good life. My older brother was in private school, and we ate well and dressed well, and we were not rich, but we were certainly well off. Suddenly, when all of our assets were devalued, my father lost his stable, and my mother lost her car. And I remember I had one pair of bib overalls that I wore to school every day, and a pair of corduroy pants that I wore to Sunday school. So we were reduced to pretty much pretty stringent conditions. We, as children, I was 7 years old at the time, and as children, we didn't fully understand the reason for our sudden change, but we certainly had to accept it, and it left an indelible impression upon us.
I can only imagine. Yeah. So you mentioned you were born in Tennessee. Did you stay there through your kind of school years? Where did you go to high school?
Yes, no, we continued to go to school locally, and at least I did up until Pearl Harbor.
So if I'm doing my math right, you were 18, 19 when Pearl Harbor occurred.
Correct, 19.
How was how was that kind of lead up to you? Did you expect anything like that to happen? Was that something that you even imagined could happen?
I certainly imagine it could happen because when my best friend and I graduated from high school in 1940, uh, we saw all of the war clouds over Europe. We were aware that uh, President Roosevelt was being pressed unmercifully to send troops and to support the British in their resistance to the Nazi regime, because Hitler was attempting to, after occupying all of Europe, to jump the channel and occupy England. And the British, of course, were going through the Battle of Britain and being confronted by particularly the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and suffering terrific damages. But the President of the United States did not have the support of the American people to join a conflict clear across the world. And therefore, he was unable to do more than offer material support to the British and to our other allies.
So as you graduate high school and you see those things going on, What is your opinion of serving in the military? Is this something you just kind of assume you're going to do? At what point does that become something that you're thinking about?
At the age we were, we knew that we were prime candidates for service if and when the United States became involved. My best friend and I were convinced that that would take place. And we thought that since we both wanted to fly, that the smartest thing we could do would be to go to Canada and join the Royal Canadian Air Force and get our wings and our commission. And then once America did become involved, we could transfer in grade to what was then the United States Army Air Corps. And we'd be a step ahead of our buddies. And we thought that was a very shrewd thing to do and proceeded to apply. And the Canadians said, well, we welcomed you and love to train you. And here's the application. So we filled those out. And at the bottom, it said, well, because you're underage, it will require parental consent. And my best friend, Sully, was an only child. His father had been mustard gassed in the First World War and died a horrible death, and Sully never knew him. So he was all his mother had. And when she heard our plan, she said, well, Sully, if you honestly feel that this is something that you must do, then you have my blessing. Well, I naturally thought that I could go home and get pretty much the same response from my own family. And when I presented the plan to my mother, and she understood that Mrs. Sullivan was willing to allow her only offspring to go to Canada and train as a pilot, that she couldn't object. But she said, well, you still have to convince your father. And when he came home and he heard the plan, he said, you blithering idiots, you don't have any idea what you're doing. And it's none of your business. That's a war around the world, on the other side of the world. And you get back in school. I'll not give you my consent. And so as a result, my friend Sully did go to Canada. He trained on Spitfires and went through the North African campaign. And meanwhile, I was in college then, locally at the University of Chattanooga. And when Pearl Harbor occurred, of course, there was no question about parental consent. I was eligible. And if you volunteered, you were allowed to select the branch of service that you would serve in. And so I immediately marched down and joined the aviation cadets and was accepted. And that began my career and also my exodus from Chattanooga.
Wow, that's really fascinating. You mentioned, Sully's father fought in the First World War. Did your family have any history of military service?
No, my father was never in the service, and so that was not the case in my own family.
Okay, so Pearl Harbor happens, you sign up, you select the aviation corps. Where do you go next? What's the process?
Well, I went immediately to Montgomery, Alabama, to Maxwell Field, where I was appointed as the cadet adjutant who was second in command of the pre-flight class, over 4,000 students. And that stood me in good stead throughout my training. I went from there to primary training in Avon Park, Florida, and succeeded in getting and soloing and getting my primary training there, and then was sent to South Carolina to Shaw Field in Sumter, where I got basic training, and ended up in Valdosta, Georgia, as in the multi-engine advanced course. If you were in multi-engine, that meant you were going to bombers. If you were in single-engine advanced, then you went to fighters. And just about everybody that joins the Air Force wants to be a fighter pilot because they have all the fun. But unfortunately, I was not selected for that, and I ended up, upon graduation, a very strange thing happened. They took 40 members of my class and sent us directly to Kearney, Nebraska, where the 100th Bomb Group, which later became known as the Bloody 100th, was preparing to go overseas. And they pulled all of the co-pilots out who were second in command of each crew, a 10-man crew. We'd never been in a B-17, and sent us overseas.
Wow. How did you feel about that at the time?
Well, we didn't realize we were the only group that they did that to. And that's never been recorded. It's never been documented. And unfortunately, that was not one of the things that I pointed out to the screenwriters of the docuseries Masters of the Air, that should be documented and made a part of history, because it happened to that group and it never happened to any other group.
So, wow, that's really interesting. So when was the first time you crawled into a B-17?
When I got to Kearney, Nebraska.
And then how long were you there before you were off to England?
Well, we were there about 3 weeks, and then they split us up and sent us to various groups to be instructors for other groups that were going overseas. Well, the push and the press for heavy bombers in Europe was so great that they immediately pulled us back together, issued us new airplanes, which had been retrofitted with extra fuel tanks, and sent us to the European theater to be confronted by the most formidable air force in the world, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, who'd been fighting for 4 years, and they knew what they were doing. We were citizen soldiers. We were terribly young. We were totally inexperienced and untrained, and yet we were sent to be confronted by this very formidable enemy who knew what they were doing. And when we arrived in England, Axis Sally came on the Berlin radio and said, "Welcome to the war, 100th Bomb Group. We know you're here. We know who the Colonel Turner has brought you over here, but this is none of your business and you don't belong here. But now that you're here, we're going to teach you a lesson." And boy, did they. Was that a baptism of fire? We were being sent out contrary to the British advice, in broad daylight, in mass formation, at high altitude, unpressurized. And the British said, "Well, you're suicidal. You can't sustain your losses. The Germans have air superiority over all of Europe, and they know what they're doing. Their backs are to the wall. They're defending their homeland, and you're 6,000 miles away." So those were the odds that we were faced with when we were thrown into the battle as cannon fodder. We were trying to prove the strategy that the British dispelled and begged us not to employ. They didn't think it was the best use of our bomber force, and Sir Arthur Harris, the head of the RAF Bomber Command, begged our commanders to abandon daylight bombing and join them in only nighttime bombing at lower altitudes where it was not so cold. The cold was one of the things that we had to contend with at high altitude of 25 to 29,000 feet. That was so inhibiting and so profoundly effective in how we functioned that we had to endure that 50 to 60 degree below zero temperatures for hours on end. And it severely impacted our ability to function.
How could it not? What do you remember about that discrepancy, right? When you guys show up and the British are telling you that what you're going to do is not the right thing to do. Do you remember any moments that kind of jump to your mind about that kind of early moment before you go on your first mission?
Well, actually, we were not aware that the British were objecting to our doing it. As crewmen, we were completely in the dark. That was high element strategy, and that was a debate that was being raged behind the scenes, and we were not privy to that information. We were just ordered to do what we were doing, and we were terribly young. We were terribly gullible, and we, of course, were following orders. And we knew we had a job to do, and we, of course, had to put our shoulders to the wheel and do the best we could to accomplish it.
Mm-hmm. What do you remember about kind of arriving in England and being there prior to your first combat experience?
Well, I remember that, of course, we were scared to death, literally. We were in our early 20s. We didn't know what we were going to be confronted with. We just knew that the German Air Force was far better equipped and more experienced than we were. And so the odds were tilted vastly in their direction. So, of course, we were approaching it very tentatively. The Germans quickly determined that our most vulnerable spot was head-on attacks, and they would get out in line abreast of 30 or 40 ships and fly directly through us and fishtail as they did and spray the whole formation with machine gun fire, cannon fire, and rockets. And they were taking horrific tolls. And of course, in the case of the 100th Bomb Group, we were handicapped because our crews were not accustomed to functioning as a unit. Our 10-man crews on each airplane were having to get to know each other, having to get to know the capabilities of the equipment that we were dealt with. And we were battling against the weather elements of clouds, fog, and rain. It was horrendous. It was just hell. And we didn't have any choice but to go out and do it day after day after day.
So you mentioned the crew, those men you flew with, right? How was it building those relationships with all of that kind of fear and uncertainty around? What do you remember about getting to know those young men?
Well, there were mixed reactions as far as the crews were concerned when their co-pilots were replaced by those of us who were so newly graduated and didn't have any familiarity with the airplane or the crews and had not been through pre-combat training as a unit. In the particular case of my crew, the crew that I was assigned to, both the navigator and the bombardier were very fond of their former co-pilot that I replaced. And they deeply resented the fact that I was so inexperienced and unknowledgeable about what we were supposed to be doing. And so they proceeded to try to trick me and make my life miserable and make me uncomfortable and get me to, I guess, beg for a replacement or a reassignment. And heaven knows what they would have gotten in my place, but nevertheless, that was their reaction. And they did everything in their power to make me uncomfortable and make it difficult for me. But I was determined that I was put in that position and I was going to make the best of it, and I did. Other crews accepted it maybe grudgingly, but nevertheless, they made the most of a bad situation. And I just had to focus on trying to learn about the B-17, which was a very complex airplane. And my job as second in command of the crew, which was very heavy responsibility, because if anything incapacitated the pilot, then I was in charge. And that really grated against the navigator and the bombardier and my crew.
Yeah, I'm sure that made it even that much more difficult. So I want to ask about your first combat mission, right? What was that like? What was that experience?
Well, our first combat mission was one of the longest that we flew in the entire war. It was 11 hours, and it was all over water. We were attacking the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire in southern France. And instead of flying over the continent, we went out to sea and then turned and attacked the very well fortified and protected submarine pens and suffered severe losses, but we managed to survive, or my crew managed to survive that mission and get back home. But 11 hours in a B-17, cramped as it was, cold as it was, and dangerous as it was really a baptism of fire. It was very horrendous. And we thought, well, my goodness, we did manage to survive that one, but we've got 24 more to do. And that was a very steep hill to climb.
So yeah, so you mentioned, right, 25 missions, this idea that you have to do this 25 times and then you get to go home, right? What you mentioned, this is a tall hill to climb. Is that something that you and your your crew and other pilots and co-pilots discussed, or was that something you kind of left to the side to not talk about?
Well, another thing happened at that stage. We did not have fighter escorts because there were no fighters in Europe until a little bit later. The RAF was furnishing us protection across the channel, but once we crossed the channel, we were over enemy territory, and they had to. Their range was so limited, they had to turn and go back and refuel. So it was virtually we were virtually flying unprotected, and the strategy was that the bomber force would be protected to a degree by escorts, and what was somehow overlooked or not taken into full account was the fact that even when we got fighter escort, the fighters were twice as fast as we were. And in order to stay with us, they had to orbit the formation and burn up fuel. And so they were very limited as to how long they could stay. And once they left, that's when the Germans jumped us. Theoretically, another group of escorts was supposed to rendezvous with us and take up where the other group left off. But that seldom happened successfully. Even though we were hundreds of ships and very easy to identify, the timing and the altitude and conditions were such that the rendezvous just very seldom came off as scheduled. And so as a result, we were just out there naked and totally unprotected against the onslaught of the very, very experienced enemy.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that's like. What about the first time you flew over the continent on one of these missions where the escorts kind of, you lose them by 1 point and then the Germans show up? What, you remember the first time that experience happened?
Well, after we had been flying, the pilot of the crew that I was assigned to was determined to fly the fastest and quickest tour and get home that he could. And so he volunteered us for every mission. And as a result, we were more experienced than most of our contemporaries. And we soon became a lead pilot of the formation. And when our crew led the formation, the co-pilot was then delegated to go back and fly the tail gun position. And he was replaced by a command pilot who was in charge of the entire formation. Well, they put me in the tail about my 5th mission. And I had never fired a 50 caliber in my life. And we had twin 50 caliber machine guns back there. And I didn't know what the heck I was supposed to be doing. Theoretically, the strategy was supposedly that a pilot in the lead ship would be the fire control officer for the entire formation in the rear direction. Well, what they completely ignored was the fact that the tail gunner didn't have any communication with the rest of the formation. He could only communicate with his pilot over the intercom. And then the pilot had to switch channels and radio to the formation what the danger was. And by then it was all over. So I unwittingly, when we came immediately under attack, bore down on the triggers and sprayed the whole atmosphere with bullets. And if I hit anything, it was an accident. But by continued firing, I burned out both barrels, and so the guns were completely useless. And I was sitting there for the whole mission, only being able to report the other planes going down or attacks coming in. But I was totally ineffective. And when we landed, I said, well, here are my wings. You taught me to fly the airplane, not to shoot a gun. And I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing back there. And I'm not getting in the tail again. And they said, well, all right, you'll have to sit on the ground then when your crew leads. And that I did. And consequently, I was 4 missions short. When they finished up, they did do the fastest tour that was ever done in the European theater. They did a tour of 25 missions in 89 days. And they got rotated back to the States, but of course I still had 4 missions to fly. And as a consequence, because I had more experience than practically anybody in the squadron or the group, they made me an operations officer of my squadron. And therefore I had ground duties and very heavy ground duties in addition to flying and completing my mission tour.
So those 25 missions you did fly, right? When how did the experience change from those early, really fraught missions towards the end? Did you notice the change in kind of air superiority and things like that? Was that part of your experience?
It was. We were, during the course of my tour, it took me as long as to fly those remaining 4 missions as it did to fly the first 21. Because we were flying so rapidly, and I didn't have the ground duties that I had when I was finishing up. But as the operations officer, you determine who in your squadron is going to fly and what position and when they're going to fly. And you have to make sure that the airplanes and the crews are ready. You have to evaluate the um, capabilities of the various crews to put them in the proper positions. And if they're showing combat fatigue, you're going to have to pull them out and send them to a rehab facility for a week or 10 days and maybe recharge their batteries and get away from the war completely and hopefully be rehabilitated to get back and finish their tours. So it was a very heavy responsibility. And as a youngster, I was hard pressed to measure up, but was determined I was going to. And I did. I ended up actually not only serving as operations officer for 1 squadron, but 2 in the course of my completing my remaining missions. And finally managed to select. I could jerry pick the missions that I flew. When our squadron was leading the formation of the group, um, it was the responsibility of either the operations officer or the squadron commander to take the command position for the formation. And so that's the way I flew my final missions, and it was uh, quite different than flying as an individual pilot on a crew, and I was terribly focused and determined that I was going to do it to the best of my ability, and hopefully did.
Yeah, I'm sure. You mentioned, this heavy responsibility of a pilot is suffering from combat fatigue or stress. You had a tremendous amount of responsibility. Did you ever need to take that time off and go rest and recuperate? And did you have any of those
Well, I
experiences?
probably should have, but unfortunately did not. Um, I was so concentrated on doing the best job I could that I never went to a rest home or rehab facility. Unfortunately, didn't get shot down, so I didn't have the POW experience. But just for the grace of God and good luck, I managed to survive my tour and was eventually rotated back to the States as an instructor to crews that were going over then, because it was still very early in the war. I finished my tour in February of 44, and the war still had another year or better to play out in the European theater.
Sure. While you were while you were in your tour, um, you were a young man when you joined. What kind of communication connection did you have with family members back home? Were you a regular letter writer? What was that? How did that impact your experience?
Well, actually, I communicated with the family rather sporadically because my duties were so heavy. And I was so engrossed and involved in fulfilling my obligations that I didn't have much time to write home. And they kept up, of course, with the news on the various raids that were being conducted by the Allies in those days, and what success they were attaining. But I did not write every day. I didn't write every week. I was really anxious to keep them from worrying about me unduly, but still I did not have the opportunity to communicate that frequently.
Yeah. Sounds like you were busy. How did you deal with the stress of not only flying and flying combat missions, but also dealing with your additional responsibilities as an operations officer?
Well, when I look back on it, I just really don't know. But the truth of the matter was that I think my success was largely due to my ability to focus my energies and my thoughts and my aspirations on the job and getting it done as well as I possibly could. I just felt the responsibility heavily and tried to respond accordingly, and that worked for me. It kept me so engrossed and occupied that I really didn't have time to become apprehensive or worry about my odds or chances of succeeding and completing my tour. Um, Unfortunately, I saw many of my comrades go down on their 24th or 25th mission. They'd get right to the lick log and suddenly be shot down and either killed or captured, and not be able to come home. One of the things that I noted that made quite an impact on me was that when we lost a crew, when they failed to return, there was no memorial, there was no funeral, there was no mention of that crew. We simply gathered their personal effects up and were ready to ship them home unless they finally showed up. But uh, in wartime, you don't have time to grieve. And you really tried to form pure personal close relationships and friendships because of that. But those were just one of the realities that you dealt with that were quite different from normal behavior, and many people don't realize that.
Yeah. Did you have any close friendships, relationships with men within your unit that maybe didn't come back?
I had some, but very few. I kept to myself mostly because I was so doggone busy.
Yeah.
And I consequently didn't have, of course, my classmates that I graduated from flying school, I still considered friendly, and we buddied together on the rare occasions that we could go down and to the nearby pub and or go to the officers club and share a drink. But by and large, it was just business and tending to business, and this took a toll on me that I didn't realize until many years later. That when I suddenly discovered upon completing my missions, I was out of a job. I no longer had any responsibility. I wasn't flying. I didn't have a crew. I didn't have anything to do. And that really bore more heavily on me than the burden of the responsibility that I'd been carrying. And so when I returned home, I was suffering from PTSD in a far greater degree than was recognized by me, myself, or my family, or certainly the authorities. And there was a 4-month stretch in there where I didn't have a blame thing to do except answer roll call. And that ended me up in a psychiatric hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, where General Arnold said, well, if our psychiatrists think that anybody is due to come over here, they've got to stay 6 weeks. And so I got over there, and here was another 6 weeks I didn't have anything to do. Answer roll call at 8 o'clock in the morning, lie on the beach or go to the bar. And that really took a terrific toll on me. And I begged them repeatedly to give me an assignment and let me try to share the experience that I had gained for those that were going over that I didn't have, but I certainly wanted to impart to those that followed me. And they didn't see fit to do that. And ironically, when I finally got an assignment, it was to go to the only instrument pilot school in America in Bryan, Texas, to learn to fly instruments. And I said, my God, I needed that before I went over to England, not after.
Yeah, the
And
order
so
of that's
I
all
was,
right.
I was very, very ticked off that they would do that. And I discovered that one of the instructors at this school, and none of the instructors had ever been overseas, but they were training people to go. And one of the instructors was a fraternity brother. And I looked him up and found that he was madly in love with one of the local girls who had a house guest. And he said, well, I'll get you a blind date with the house guest this weekend. And why don't we and uh, her older sister and her date, triple date, and we'll take the girls out to the officers club on Saturday night and dancing and dinner and all. And I said, well, that sounds okay. So I get out there and get in the light and see the older sister. And I say, uh-oh, I got the wrong date. I was in love immediately.
Yeah.
And eventually, that's a long story, but eventually we became engaged and married for 71 years. So that was the luckiest thing that happened to me. And that was pretty much the pattern of my experience.
Wow.
Damn lucky.
You got the right nickname, sir, I think. So you complete your tour in February 44 and you come home and you're in the service till the end of the war?
No, I was offered a regular commission when the Air Force became a separate branch in 1947 and accepted that. And they had a marvelous program that any of these newly integrated officers could go back to any college in America and complete their education or go for 4 years with full pay and allowances, including flying pay. So I applied and was accepted at Stanford and was ready to go. And the fall semester was coming up and I never got any orders. So I flew down I was then assigned to the 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas at Carswell Air Force Base. And I flew down to Maxwell Field, which the Air University was administering that program. And I said, hey, you got this marvelous program. And I applied and was accepted, but I've never gotten the orders. How come? And they said, well, how old are you? And I said, well, I happen to be 26 right now. Why? And they said, well, you know, we have an age limit of 32 in that program. And I said, okay, so what? They said, well, the problem is that we've got so many in the ahead of you that if they don't get in, why, they lose out. And I said, well, how long do you think I'll have to wait just to get in the pipeline? And they said, according to our calculations, just before your 32nd birthday. And I said, hey, wait a minute. I've been out of college now for 6 years. You want me to wait another 6 years before I hit the books again? And they said, well, we're sorry, but that's the way the system is structured. So I flew back to Carswell, and I had gotten married to my sweetheart by then. And I said, well, you know, I could go back under the GI Bill as a civilian today and not have to wait 6 years. And I think without at least a bachelor's degree, I'm pretty useless. So I think I'll resign my commission. So I resigned my regular commission and got out of the Air Force to go back to college and complete it, and ended up not at Stanford, but at that time there were so many going into the colleges, they were being flooded, and it was not easy to get in. And so, but I managed to secure a position in the business school at the University of Denver. And so I resigned my commission in September of 1948 after 6.5 years of service, and went back to college and got my degree.
What was your rank when you left the service?
Well, at the time I was going to school, I was also acting as a executive director of a philanthropic foundation for my mother-in-law, who owned a bunch of property in Denver. And also, she owned a bunch of property in downtown Denver, and the largest real estate company there was managing her assets. And they said, well, we'll give Lucky a job as a property manager, teaching property management. And so I went with this as part-time real estate company and learned commercial real estate, and then eventually became left there and formed a partnership and developed air-conditioned mall shopping centers, and did the first one west of the Mississippi in 1956. And then eventually moved to Dallas, and that's where I still reside after 60 years.
Well, what was that first shopping center?
It's called Lakeside Shopping Center in Northwest Denver. And then I came down to Amarillo and did one there, and then in Dallas, and became so impressed with the opportunities and the economic climate in Dallas compared to Denver at the time that I thought it'd be a better place to headquarter, and so I moved here.
So as you're kind of leaving the service, I want to ask a couple questions before we kind of round this thing out. This is a hard question, but what was your favorite part of serving? If you have something that kind of sticks out, what do you remember most fondly about your time in the service?
My time in the service?
Yes, sir.
Well, I loved flying the B-17. I was really considered myself extremely fortunate to have been assigned that aircraft, because it proved to be able to withstand far more battle damage than the B-24, its counterpart, and still got me home. I was so impressed with the ability of it to do that, that one of the first things I did when I got home was to go buy some Boeing stock. But I did find it was very gratifying to head a crew, and to, of course, it was a pretty heavy responsibility for a 20-year-old to have not only his own hide, but 9 other guys' lives depended upon his ability in a pinch. And I consider that a major accomplishment in my life. It certainly matured me overnight. From a hairy-headed college kid, I became a battle-weary pilot pretty quickly, and with all that went with it. But I think the experience was so horrendous, and it was so unpleasant, that I didn't talk about it for 50 years. I didn't burden my family with it. It held memories and nightmares that I wanted to forget, not remember. And so I didn't talk about it for a long while, until I was finally urged to speak about it at a symposium at North Texas University of North Texas in 1999. And the sponsor of that symposium, who used to be a military history professor at the Air Force Academy, Colonel Hurley, said, "Well, Lucky, that was quite a speech. Did you write it?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir. I was unsure what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it, so I did write it out." He said, "Well, with your permission, I'm writing a book, and I'd like to include it in my book." So I gave it to him, and as a consequence, it produced quite an outpouring of requests for speeches to particularly college or students, from professors and academics who appreciated what I said and how I said it. And so I got on what I call the rubber chicken circuit, and and have been doing that for over 30 years.
Well, I understand why you keep getting asked. You tell a wonderful story, and I very
But
much
I
appreciate.
certainly want to impart personally my experience and feelings of the sacrifices that were made to the younger generations today, because if we had not made them as we did, they wouldn't be here. None of us would be. And we felt that our values and freedom were extremely important, enough to lay down our lives if necessary to do so.
Well, I'm one of those academics that's trying to make sure people understand exactly what happened and what it all means. As you kind of moved on from the Air Force, you said you didn't talk about this for a long time. Did you ever become involved in veterans organizations or anything like that?
Yes, I even started some veterans organizations, and my mom group has reunions and still does, which I attend, and I've become associated with many museums. The one at University of North Texas, the Historical Aviation Collection. There, I volunteered for 25 years, and I annually go to various museums to observe Memorial Day and Veterans Day and such events as that, and of course have been asked to comment on the Masters of the Air docuseries about the 100th Bomb Group, and I make frequent appearances as a consequence of that. So it keeps me busy, and as my dear departed wife says, well, at least it keeps you off the streets and out of the bars.
How was that experience when Masters of the Air came out? What was that like?
Well, I was flown out to Hollywood for the premiere and got to meet Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg and the directors and film writers of the series. I was terribly interested in seeing that series took 10 years to produce. And during the course of its production, I was interviewed about 4 or 5 times. And I brought to their attention the things that I knew that happened to the 100th that didn't happen to any other groups. And when Tom Hanks came up to me after the premiere and said, well, Lucky, what did we get wrong? And I said, well, with all due respect, I think I'll reserve my opinion until I've seen all 9 episodes because I've only seen this one. And he said, oh, okay. But I wanted to see how, if they did, they treated those things that I mentioned. And I thought it was a golden opportunity for them to document it historically because it had not been documented previously, and that was an opportunity to do it. But they focused the series on the personalities of the people that they highlighted. And I knew them all. I didn't recognize them because they didn't look like that. And they put mustaches on many of them, and they didn't have mustaches. But at any rate, I think they did an epic job of portraying some of what it was like for us to go through as the 8th Air Force, the opposition that we put up and eventually prevailed in subduing the hideous Nazi regime and Third Reich during World War II. And we're accidental parts of history, but as such, I think we have a duty and a responsibility to try and convey as best we can the reasons and the purposes by which we agreed to sacrifice and put ourselves on and stand up and be counted when our nation called on us to do so.
Sure. Well, I appreciate your time here, sir. I have a couple last follow-up questions. As you know, this initial project is in partnership with the Air and Space Force Association, and a question that we'd like to ask is, what advice would you have for young people entering the military today and in this next generation of Americans who are interested in serving? What would your advice be for them?
I think the best advice that I can offer is that you should live every day to its fullest, because it might be your last. We never know.
Yeah, that's good advice. Thank you, sir. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the interview that I didn't ask, I didn't cover, something you'd like to sign off with, or?
No, I would only add this postscript that, as I mentioned earlier, I am doing my best to foment a grassroots effort to convince Congress to designate a day for a National Day of Recognition for our home front heroes, without whom we would not have prevailed.
Yeah, it's a noble effort and something I fully agree with. So, yeah. Okay. Well, Lucky, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this, and it's really been an honor to talk to you today.
Thank you, James. I've enjoyed being with you.